Okay, welcome back everybody for the afternoon and the final session of our conference. And our speaker this afternoon, our first speaker is Jasia Reichardt, and she's asked me not to read her biography, so I won't, but it's on the papers for you. So she's going to speak about Schendel and concrete poetry, and just if you would sit a little bit further towards the front if you can, just so that you can see the drawings on the whiteboard. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I have my... good. There we are. Fine. Right. So, I shall talk first about concrete poetry, images made of letters, words, symbols, and then I will try to place Mira Schendel somewhere within this whole vast area. At the time, relevant to our subject, Mira looked like this. What she is holding is a work made up of rolled up pieces of rice paper, which you all know about, which belongs to the series she called Little Nothings. In 1960s, that was the time when Mira Schendel made her early works using words, letters, and symbols, and it was a period when the movement of concrete poetry was already flourishing worldwide. Letters and words that combined into images were appearing increasingly, often in exhibitions, in art magazines, and it is best not to venture a precise date when concrete poetry has its beginning. There wasn't a beginning. Different dates have been assigned by historians and practitioners as to when visually animated texts merged under the heading of concrete poetry. Poems using letters to create images have a long history, even longer than this example, a visual poem by George Herbert, who was an early 17th century Anglican priest and poet. What we can be certain of is that by the beginning of the 20th century, there were already a great many artists, poets, and designers using letters of the alphabet to make images. It was in 1953 that Eugen Gomringer, an artist living in Bern, started using the term concrete poetry, and it has been used ever since as a general label, although by now it probably means whatever we want it to mean. Henri Chopin, who published a sound poetry magazine called Ou, he called this kind of poetry evolutionary poetry. Visual poetry has also been called semiotic, semantic, kinetic, lettrist, typstructic, and temporal. Who were and who are the concrete poets? Among them were painters involved with geometric and concrete art and kinetic art, experimental poets, designers, and designers of manifestos and posters and typographers, musicians, and many others who wanted to create messages that operate on several levels. The first international exhibition of concrete and kinetic poetry in England took place in Cambridge in 1964. It was organized by Mike Weaver and it included every type of visual poetry. It was divided under various headings, ranging from constructivist to phonetic to kinetic poems, although, of course, some poems belong to all these, as well as other categories. It was only many decades later that one could see this movement in a more realistic perspective. The second exhibition of concrete poetry in England was held at the ICA in 1965-66. Still, when the ICA was in its old premises at 17 Dover Street, the exhibition had a more general title. It was called Between Poetry and Painting, and once more included every type of visual poetry composed of letters, including Lewis Carroll's Mouse's Tale, the work of the futurists such as Le Mot en Liberté Marinetti, Apollinaire, of course, whose work was and continues to be fundamental to any experiment with words. Every sort of visual text was included that could provide a history to what in all other respects appeared to be a new movement. The words of Rimbaud rang in our ears. I invented the color of vowels, A, black, E, white, I, red, O, blue, U, green. I controlled the form and movement of each consonant and flatter myself with instinctive rhythm I might invent someday or other a poetic verb accessible to all the five senses. I reserved the right of translation. At first, it was an experiment. I wrote silences, nights. I took notes of the inexpressible. I transfixed vertigos. So that was Rimbaud. Most concrete poetry, however experimental, was more down to earth. Max Spencer was one of the exhibitors. He was a scientist, philosopher, and a major influence on the computer art movement in Stuttgart. Several languages emerge in his poems. Sometimes their inclusion is intended to complicate the meaning and or to give the poem its shape, or perhaps a range of sounds that applies when it is read aloud in the pronunciation of different languages. Repetition with small, gradual changes is one of the keys of concrete poetry. You start with something, here, ir, to go in Spanish, and end with ri, past participle of to laugh in French. This poem about Rio was called Mountains Without Valleys, and I dare say that there is more to be discovered about it. In 1965, as Rio celebrated its 4th centenary, there were other poems about in the city, and by then Brazil was the center of concrete poetry in Latin America. This is one of the symbols for that 4th centenary, but Aloysio Magalhães, it assumed the form of graffiti that appeared throughout the city. This poem by Spencer was called Cartesian Concrete. Here we travel from one word to another until we arrive at, I think that something is. One more piece by Spencer, which he called statistical text. All the words in the text, which are repeated throughout, can be placed in different order and then can be included in any statement which needs to be completed. It is up to the reader to shuffle the words and to add something to complete the sentence. The last line reads, but it is still not. You could say that in this text, Spencer is involved more with a system of arranging words than with poetry. But concrete poetry didn't have to be poetic. It is possible that during her visit to London in 1966, Mira Schendel visited Between Poetry and Painting exhibition, but she certainly met Max Benzer later that year in Stuttgart. This was a meeting which, according to what she said herself, had exerted a significant influence on her work. At the time, her own work with letters was very varied in content. She too came to use different languages in her compositions, as in these two images. She too placed words deliberately within the space of the page. It is also possible that her image, which includes the word red, refers to the Concrete Poetry magazine that was published by Hans-Jörg Meyer in Stuttgart at the time. At least 2 of the numbers were devoted to Max Benzer. However, Benzer put emphasis on structure, on a system, on code, and I don't somehow think that this underlying method was of great significance to Mira Schendel. But more of this later. So, concrete poetry was multilingual. It was also paradoxical. It ranged from works such as this collage poem with soft texture by Jiri Collage, which he called self-evident poem, which it certainly isn't, to Gomringer's single-word poem, a very minimal and very insistent and loud composition, considering the meaning of the word silencio. Concrete poetry movement was the first truly international art movement. This was due partly because words and symbols were its medium and paper was its main material. It was and is portable. There were many exceptions, of course, like this kinetic sculpture by Ken Cox. As the sculpture was set in rotation, the letters formed were amor voluptas pulchritudo, and of course in different combinations. The program was random because Cox wanted to avoid repetitions. 3-dimensional works are an exception, but most examples of concrete poetry can be sent, printed, reprinted in different sizes because the scale matters less than in any other art form, except perhaps in computer graphics. There are other similarities between concrete poetry and computer graphics. A program, for instance, according to which the words or letters progress as they do here. This is a poem for recitation by Ernst Jandl. Here the letters forming the square are affected by the underlying triangle, not only in their appearance, but also when the poem is recited in their pronunciation. Sometimes there's a concrete poem that has the artist's fingerprint, bears his or her handwriting, but more often than that, this draft or sketch is replaced by letraset or type. Its size might be dictated by the size of available paper, the empty page in a magazine, or the editor's idea of what it should finally look like. Sometimes it is the poet who is responsible for the way it reaches its audience, but very often it isn't. This, of course, was not the case with Mira Schendel. Her concrete poems, and she didn't call them that, were either written by hand or, like her monotypes, textured and colored. The touch of the hand was always there. She too used letraset, sometimes, but not always, like her monotypes made with powdered rice paper sticking to glass. Her pieces with letters had layers of texture. Despite the ready-made quality of letraset, the effect was soft and the letters were masked, as if seen through a screen. They conveyed the effect of translucency and improvisation, as in this very familiar by now disc, which is on the cover of the program. Sometimes the letters are very faint, as in this graphic object in the form of a spiral. Elsewhere, the work is dense, like a wood. The letters are painted on top of lines in browns and reds. Some works are detailed, others are gestural with squiggles and words. Schendel improvised, but the most personal images in this genre were letters that were part of a drawing. Ma che bellezza di disegno, but what beauty is in drawing, she wrote in Italian in one of her pictures. The phrase is itself a drawing to which the comment refers. Unfortunately, I haven't got an image of it. But we already know that her drawing and writing are one. She describes what she feels. Como me divertido, how it pleases me, she wrote in another picture. So how does Mira Schendel fit into the scheme of concrete poetry? I wonder if she does. At some point, I attempted to make a map of the sort of art that includes letters. You can call it concrete poetry, visual poetry, or something else. The sort of work doesn't really want to be captured or defined, especially by someone other than its authors. Like all art, it too resists classification, and especially the critic's desire for order. Even so, here is the map, and I'm going to ask Nick to do some filling in. And the map is in the shape of a triangle, and of course, it won't stay empty for too long. The placing of the poems within the triangle depends on the degree that they gravitate towards one of the three corners. What we start with is the acknowledgement that all the poems we are dealing with are visual. Here are some examples. Towards the top, we would place the visual poems that are closer to literature. They tell stories, provide an account of something that happens, and here is the first example. A poem by Stephen Temerson about time. It takes a minute to count a minute, and the time spent counting doesn't count. The second poem that belongs here is page number 148 from A Humament by Tom Phillips. It hints rather than tells us what happens. Here the page of the book is painted out, and the surviving words contribute to a new story. The third example is a self-explicit picture story by John Furnivall of a boy and a girl in a field of rye, and if you follow the lexical key provided, you can see that we reach a satisfactory conclusion. At the bottom of the triangle on the right, there are poems that gravitate towards sound. So here we have part of the Ursonata by Kurt Schwitters and a poem by Raoul Hausmann with a photograph of himself in full flow of recitation. Some poems, sorry? Yes, please, Hausmann's also on the right. And the next one is Bob Cobbing. So some of his poems were to be recited like a canon by a group of people. There could be, for instance, 6 people. So the first person reads 2 lines and continues till the end of the poem, and then every 2 lines, another person starts reading from the beginning. This creates a gradually richer and richer textured sound. Each reader in turn stops when they reach the end of the poem, or everyone could read the poem twice because this is a very short one.
Where do you want Cobbing?
Cobbing is sound, yes, Bob Cobbing. And this is another sound one. This is a work by the Spaniard Reichardt, and it shows men bombarded by the din of mass media. And of course, he pleads for silence. Now, bottom left of the triangle, we are close to art. And there we will have pictures made of words that depict something that could have been painted. So here is one of them. And here we have an image of nature. This is a 1920s poem by the Polish painter and poet Tytus Czyżewski. Okay, well, okay, you've got it. So it doesn't give his name there, but okay. So, because it's a diagram of a garden, a picture of a garden, I would place it near that corner. And here is another pictorial poem, A Flower for Jasia, by Mary Ellen Salt. So Mary Ellen Salt also goes in that corner. So thank you. I think that's all the writing for the moment. So all concrete poems should fit somewhere within that triangle, or so I thought. But Mira Schendel doesn't quite belong. To any theory about art, there are exceptions, and she seems to be one of those. But more of that later. In concrete poetry in Brazil, as elsewhere, we encounter satire, irony, games, innuendos, jokes. Here is a much-quoted poem with its English translation, Beba Cola by Deshu Pignatari. Perhaps the sound and the look of the poem are more attractive before one understands the meaning of the content. And here is Pedro Xisto, Epithalamium. It isn't as simple as it looks. Is S a serpent or a she? Is H human or a he? Are we to believe the poet's explanation at the bottom? He also mentions Eva, but where is she? This is a typical poem of Haroldo de Campos, and it is fairly typical also of the poets and artists of the Neugandres group that was formed in Brazil in the 50s. The translation of the poem on the right may be approximate, but it still expresses the simple, insistent idea that the crystal is in search of its form. Mira Schendel, of course, knew the members of the Neugandres group. Its principal members were the brothers Haroldo and Augusto de Campos, Décio Pinhatari, and Ronaldo Azeredo. Augusto, like Mark Spencer, played a key role in aiding and abetting Mira's journey as an artist. Both of them encouraged, inspired, and wrote about her. For her exhibition at the Museo de Arte Moderna in Rio in 1966, Haroldo wrote a beautiful poem as an introduction. Her work, however, had less in common with the movement of concrete poetry than one might expect. She was at the edge looking in, experimenting, yes, but trying to find her own way with languages, words, and letters. She was, in a way, talking to herself, and sometimes seeming uncertain about what to say. So what sort of concrete poems might Mira Schendel have found affinity with? Probably not those that are based on code, that are insistent or provocative. I thought of several that she might have felt at home with. Some of them are by Dom Sylvester Ueda, with whom she once shared an exhibition in 1968 at Signals in London. Ueda made this version of Basho's haiku from one of the many literary translations. The Basho haiku means essentially, old pond, frog jumps in, sound of water. There were several concrete poetry versions of this haiku. Of course, Dom Sylvester's original was produced on a typewriter, like this one. Here the subject is time, the subject close to Mira's heart, and Dom Sylvester used it as a Christmas card in 1988. Some of Ueda's poems were in color and, of course, done on a typewriter. And sometimes, as here, there were no words at all. Another work that I imagine would be closer in spirit to Mira Schendel is by Gerald Riem. Against a black background, the wide diagonal line reaches a single word at the bottom, bleiben, to stay. Still, another work she might have liked is a 1922 poem by the Polish poet Jan Nepomucen Miller, who wrote an article entitled The Poetry of Punctuation Marks. He proposed the creation of poetry of punctuation composed solely of printing signs. He wrote, compositions of that kind would stand on the border of poetry, painting, and the graphic arts, leading to the breakup of printing conventions. He went on to describe it as the abstract art of the 21st century, when printing art will give way to some higher technique, a sort of autotype, reproducing handwritten manuscripts in thousands of copies. He was talking 90 years ago about what we live with now. And Mira Schendel might have liked the spirit of his words and of course the punctuation. Mira distrusted the quest for the rational of some of the artists and poets, and the imprecision in her work was the result of her aim to catch time, to record the moment, and as one critic remarked, to paint the inexpressible. She wrote, "My work constitutes an attempt to immortalize fleeting moments. I must seize the very instant in which the living experience seeps onto this symbol, which in this case is the letter. These characters simulate the time past, but do not seize the irretrievable living experience that characterizes time. Anyone can read and reread my scribbles on paper, but no one can read time." Well, she couldn't either. But she did what she could. She made beautiful and poetic marks on paper. So I finished with this, and now you're going to see a film, and I'm going to ask Geraldo, if you would, to translate some sentences from the Portuguese. So let's see if they are there.
I bring the aid this way and concentrate. Open the door. Catch the book. And sit down. Invent another way. See? Oh, Tekla is a difficult one. Touch the letters. Where are you? Rain or drizzle. With a way of Mira, invert the order. Try. Take risk. Draw the letter. The wild letter. Scribble the ideas of the mind. Make everything transparent. The gesture of the hands, unveil the gesture of the hands, of the soft line or hard edge or the hard line that take risk and doesn't pierce. Give back the E there and bring the L here. right Schendel without mistake. With a big ladder. And what separates is not hard, acute storm. And final. The play is over.